So once there was a baby, and once there was a blanket. Now, the baby really was in search of a blanket, and the blanket was in search of a baby, and you would think that that would be a simple match to make, because isn't it normal that someone makes a blanket, crochets or knits or weaves a blanket for a baby? And isn't it the common thing that the baby's mother or family accepts that blanket for the baby and it's ready for the baby right away? Well, wouldn't you know that we have a baby who had not been given a blanket, who didn't have a family to receive the blanket, and yet there was something in that baby that wanted to be wrapped tightly in a blanket and for it to be soft and wondrous. And there was a blanket that had been made by a grandmother. She had grandchildren who are now grown, but she so loved babies that whenever she heard of someone, a friend's daughter or granddaughter or someone in the neighborhood, she would say, "Oh, may I make a blanket for the baby?" But it just so happened that as she was finishing this blanket, the older woman had passed on. And her family wasn't sure what to do with the blanket because they weren't sure who the blanket had been for. So now we have a baby in search of a blanket, in search of a baby, and no matchmaking happening here yet. So it just so happened that the old woman's youngest granddaughter worked in an orphanage of sorts. They didn't call it an orphanage anymore. It had some fancy name, but basically it was a residence for children who were unclaimed. And so this baby had gone there, for she did not have anyone who claimed her, not mother nor father nor other family members. And so she got there and they gave her this kind of scratchy, thin little blanket, and the baby cried and cried and cried. So the youngest granddaughter of the old woman, she was such a lovely person with a big heart, and she just had this feeling that her grandmother's blanket that had no baby for it would just fit so well with this baby. And she loved this baby. She would sneak in and snuggle up to the baby and make the baby laugh and blow bubbles on the baby's belly and all the things that a mother would do to a child. But the granddaughter had no children. And she just kept thinking her grandmother's blanket would be so good with that baby. So she went to the director and said, "Mrs. Mart, you know our newest arrival?" Everyone knew, because everyone could hear the baby howl. And Mrs. Mart said, "Yes, I know she has a spot in your heart already." "Well, yes. I just wondered, you know, my grandmother passed away recently, and she was just finishing a baby blanket, but none of us have any idea for whom that blanket was. Could I bring that in for the little one? I would just so love to do that. And I would gift it, that would be a gift." "Well, that is very sweet of you, of course." So the next day, the granddaughter stopped by her mother's house where all the things from her grandmother's house were, and she picked up the blanket, the baby blanket, and she brought it in, and she went in and she unwound the baby from that rough, thin blanket and wrapped the baby up in this beautiful yellow blanket with pinks and blues in it. It was like a summer day, and she rocked the baby in her arms and sang to her, and time just seemed to get away from her until the director came in and said, I think it's time to start your day. Oh, she said, I'm so sorry. And as Mrs. Mart walked out with the young woman, she said to her, have you ever thought of fostering a child to see if perhaps you'd like to adopt one? Oh, the young woman closed her eyes, because if she could just foster that baby or adopt her, she would in a heartbeat. I don't know if I qualify. Well, let's take a minute and look at the requisition. So Mrs. Mart walked her through what was necessary, and as the young woman heard it, she thought, I don't know why I thought it was more than that. I think I qualify. Could we start the process? Yes. And I want to put my name in for the baby. You know. I do know, said Mrs. Mart. I do. And so the process began, and the baby was loving the blanket, and now she cooed, and she smiled, and she googled and gurgled, and all the sounds that babies make. And now people wanted to stop by and see her. And the granddaughter became very nervous. What if someone else took her home? She already thought of this baby as hers. The paperwork was finished. Her house had been reviewed. Everything was in order. And the young woman came home with the baby. Now, when she got home, her whole family was there. They had food for her. They had all the items from a shower to give her things that she would need for a newborn. And the woman was overwhelmed with that love from her family. And the baby was passed from one to the other to the other. That baby was loved up more than it could have been anywhere else. And the young woman was so grateful. And that night, when she placed the baby in the crib, she put a hand on the back of the baby, and she raised her hand and she said, God, you knew my heart. You knew how much I wanted a baby. And I want to thank you. And I tell you that I commit to caring for this child as my own, to care for her and guide her and love her as you have loved me. And I thank you, Lord Jesus, for being with me as I walk through this. And I ask in your name that I be a mother of love and compassion for my daughter. And then she bent down and kissed the baby on the nape of its neck. In all the years to come, she remembered that moment, for as she kissed the baby's neck, she felt her grandmother's blanket, the blanket that had been in search of a baby. And now here in her home was the baby in search of a blanket, a perfect match. And many years later, when she watched her walk down to receive her diploma, she stood up and clapped and clapped, and in her pocket was a small remnant of that blanket from her grandmother. She always took it whenever she celebrated with her daughter, for truly it was her grandmother who brought them together.